Don't ever take your eyes off your children this Halloween. Dad, just a few more houses, please? Why did I say yes? I blame myself every day, but how could I not? If you saw his face, if you saw those big beautiful brown eyes staring up at you, I don't see how you could refuse. My son, Daniel, dressed as Captain Jack Sparrow for the second year in a row, pulled and tugged at my hand until I relented. I agreed to just a few more houses, then we go home, okay? I was weak, spurned on by love. We had finished our third block of houses. His pillow sack was almost full of all sorts of candy, a fact I was reminded of every passing minute as I lugged it around on my back. He had one of those small plastic pumpkin carriers for the front doors, and then he'd run back to me and dump the contents into the pillowcase. Our system was flawless, a perfect combination of teamwork and strategy meant to produce maximum amounts of candy. Those answering the door would see an adorable Jack Sparrow with an empty bucket, and most of them would add some extra candied bars or gum packets to accommodate the poor pirate. So he didn't need more candy. He was just enjoying the night, an unseasonably warm October after so many years of miserably cold Halloween nights. I couldn't say no. Children only have so many years of trick or treating in them, and I wanted him to make the most of each one. We walked down an alleyway to the next block, the last street before the country fields took over. The first house was lit up with orange and white lights, fake spider webs draped over their hedges. He practically sprinted up to the door, not noticing the fake body sitting on the chair. At least I thought it was fake. It started to move. I tried to yell and warn Daniel, but the body on the chair already grabbed my son's arm, emitting a howling growl at the same time. Daniel, Captain Daniel, was unfazed. He even started to laugh. I was so proud of him in that moment. After thanking the woman at the door and wishing her a happy Halloween, he sprinted back to me, excitedly dumping the contents of his conquest into the bulging pillow sack. Dad, did you see me? I wasn't scared at all. Buddy, you are a champ. If that was me, a little bit of pee would have come out. Bet on it. We shared a laugh together, and he threw his arms around me. It would be the last time either of us would laugh. I looked down at his eyeliner-streaked face, his beautifully crafted hand-sewn pirate hat, courtesy of the missus, and to my everlasting shame, I said the words that haunt me every day. Okay, little captain, one more house. There were only 3 more on the street. The 2 beside the house we had just gone to were dark and had no decorations on them. Every child and parent knows this as the universal sign of don't bother coming to my house for candy. So we skipped those 2 and ended up at the house at the end of the road. To his credit, Daniel noticed that it also didn't have any decorations, but the front porch light was on. He looked at me, silently asking for my approval. I didn't get a sense that anything was particularly wrong or off about the house. Even though it didn't have any of the lights or spiderwebs or fake bodies the other houses had, the outside light was on, and we could both see a red and white candy-striped bucket on the front porch. There was also a note above the bucket, and I could already guess that it instructed that you take a few pieces of candy and be on your way. But I was always cautious, ever weary. I told him to stay on the sidewalk, and I walked up to the front porch. I picked up the note. It read, "If no one should answer when you ring the bell, please take a candy and I wish you well." There were no windows that I could subtly peer into, but the house on the outside was perfectly presentable. The porch was clean, the lawn crisply cut and clearly maintained. I peered inside the bucket, and my eyes lit up. Even as an adult I knew that full-size chocolate bars were rare, but there they were. Snickers, Mars, O. Henry. All of the classics, in full-size glory. I was so excited for Daniel. I turned around and went back to the sidewalk, where he was practically brimming with energy. Even after a long night like this one, he was raring to go. I put on my best pirate voice. "All right, Captain, the note says to knock on the door, and if no one answers, you can take one of the treats from the bucket. Just one though, okay? Make it fair for the other children." "Aye, me matey," he said back in his best pirate voice. We gave each other a fist pump. He walked up the pathway to the front door. I made sure to watch him the whole way. It could be another setup, some clever house owners putting together an elaborate ruse to get the children's guard down before they reveal the big scare. My phone vibrated once in my pocket. No doubt it was a text message from my wife. I watched as my son knocked on the door and patiently waited. We agreed before the night began that if nobody answered within 10 seconds, then it was time to move on. I remember every detail of those next 10 seconds. 1. I took my phone out of my pocket, still keeping an eye on Daniel. 2. I entered the code and without looking at the phone, unlocking the screen. 3. Daniel was still waiting at the door. 4. Through muscle memory I brought up the new messages screen, still not taking my eyes off my son. 5. He began to turn around. 6. He started to head towards the bucket left on the front porch. 7. He smiled at me. 8. I glanced down at my phone. Sent, you and the captain okay? 9. Reply, on our way home. 10. Daniel was gone. I didn't register it at first. I figured he was hiding behind something. Daniel, I called out. Daniel. There was no reply. I ran up to the porch, but I found nothing. No clue as to where he had gone. There was no way he could have ran around the house, not in the span of 1 to 2 seconds. No way. I looked up and down the street, but there was no one. No parents, no kids, nobody. Did someone open the door? Was he inside? I started to pound furiously on the front door, screaming my son's name. I was screaming at the top of my lungs as I tugged at the door handle, trying to get it open. I must have screamed loud enough because the woman whose house Daniel was so brave had opened her door and yelled after me. Is everything all right? No. Have you seen my son? The little boy dressed as a captain? Oh my goodness, no I haven't. Should I call someone? Call someone? His cell phone. I smacked myself in the forehead. I forgot he had one on him. I grabbed the phone out of my pocket and dialed his number. It went straight to voicemail. I almost threw the phone away right then and there, but I tried to calm myself down. Tried to think back. But all I could picture was someone, something, opening the door, grabbing my son and covering his mouth before he could scream for me. I dialed 911. I didn't care if we found him later, if he was playing some trick on me. I just wanted him back. I told the neighbor to grab a flashlight and help me look for him. When the cops arrived, the neighbor and I had been looking all around the house, trying to find a way in. I was about to break a window when I heard the sirens. Those wailing screams echoing in the distance. I took such comfort in those sirens. I just knew in my heart that as soon as they got here, my son would pop out of somewhere, tell me it was all a big joke. I wouldn't scold him, I wouldn't yell at him. I would just hug and squeeze and hold on to him until he left for college. I told the cops everything, down to the exact detail as I remembered it. They also pounded on the door, but when they saw my frantic behavior, the impatience riddling my body, they went ahead and broke the door in. They told me to stay behind, let them clear the house. I wanted to protest, to scream at them, to tell them nothing could keep me away. But when they drew their guns and yelled into the house, I knew they were taking this seriously. 5 of the longest minutes of my life passed by. I don't know when she did it, but at one point I looked down and the neighbor was holding my hand. She had children of her own. She knew what was happening, what could be happening. When the 2 cops came out of the house, the look on their faces said it all. I almost broke down there on the street, but I had to hold on a little longer. I tore into the house, past the outstretched arms of the officers, and started yelling for my son, bursting in and out of each room with ferocious intent. It wasn't until I went up the stairs into what was once a bedroom that I realized no one was living in this house. No one had been living in this house for years. I ran down the stairs, almost knocking the officers down as I ran up to the woman, the helpful neighbor. I grabbed her and started yelling. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell me no one was living here? She started to stammer, taken aback by my sudden turn, my aggression towards her. I didn't know. I've only lived on this street for a few months. I never saw anyone come in or out, but that could be for 100 different reasons. I'm sorry. I didn't know. I stood there, on the street, breathing heavily, holding on to the shoulders of a woman I only met a few minutes before. The officers placed their hands on my arms and I released her. I looked back at the house, that 2-story monstrosity bathed in darkness, and I knew. However impossible it was, I knew right there and then. Daniel wasn't coming back. Things for me were dark, really dark, for many months afterwards. I don't really remember all of the police searches, the news bulletins, the press conferences. I ignored the pitted looks of my friends, the suspicious glares of my neighbors. My wife and I, despite everything, remained strong together. Every night we told each other, no body, no death. In our hearts, Daniel was alive. The initial investigation of the house amounted to almost nothing. The previous owner had declared bankruptcy and abandoned the house. The bank hadn't been able to sell it to anyone, so it sat there collecting dust. No one could account for the maintained lawn out front, and the police never found any bucket full of chocolate bars or any note. I don't care what they say, I know what I saw. I know there were some on the police force that suspected me. I went through rigorous interrogations, but they came up with nothing, as I knew they would. I didn't blame them. If I had been in their position, I would have suspected me as well. After 3 months, all things concerning Daniel dissipated, except for in our household. We still put out flyers all over the surrounding neighborhoods every week. We still kept up to date with social media, pleading anybody and everybody to keep an eye out for our boy. I drained my accounts hiring private detectives to look into the house, the neighborhood, anything that I thought could help. They all came up with nothing. No clues. No traces. Daniel had simply vanished. Every night I had the same nightmare. Someone knocks on the door to our house, and I race down, hoping against all hope that it's Daniel. And every time I open the door it is Daniel, and he's standing there in his Captain Jack uniform and his pumpkin candy carrier. I scream out in joy and grab a hold of him, except his flesh starts to melt and sift through my fingers. His body turns into sand, and suddenly my son is a pile of dust and dirt on the carpet. Then I wake up. 2 weeks ago I was on the couch in the afternoon staring at the ceiling when I heard a knock on the door. I got up slowly, thinking it was a reporter coming to do a follow-up, or some punk kid claiming to have seen my son, something that happened all too often. I opened the door and nearly screamed. Not in joy but in sheer terror. My son was standing there. Daniel. My wife came barreling down the stairs, and she screamed as well, but hers was all happiness. She pushed me out of the way and took Daniel up in her arms. I couldn't move. I kept waiting for his body to turn into mush, his ashes spilling through my wife's fingers. I kept waiting to wake up in my bed, sweating and crying. But that didn't happen. Against every single odd in the book, Daniel had been returned. Through all the crying and hugging and kissing, Daniel didn't say a word. He was just there. No expression on his face, nothing registering in his eyes. We put it down to shock. Clearly something had happened to him. As each day passed, not a single doctor or therapist or police officer could find anything physically wrong with him. Everything should be in working order, said one particularly pompous doctor after examining Daniel. I can't tell you where your son was, or what happened to him, but whatever happened, nothing is wrong with him on the outside. Nothing was wrong with him on the outside? I nearly knocked out that smiling white coat right there and then, but I was so elated to have Daniel back that I shrugged it off, ignored it. Nothing mattered anymore. Daniel was home. Later that night, I was sitting at the dinner table after having tucked Daniel in when I came to the sudden realization that I wasn't exactly happy. I should have been. I should have been screaming over the rooftops with complete joy in my heart. But something was wrong. Daniel wasn't Daniel anymore. That happy, brave boy had come back, different. I tried to think about why. Obviously it had something to do with where he had been, what had happened to him. But there was something else. Something nagging at the back of my neck. Then with a cold, sinking feeling, I remembered. Daniel had said something when I tucked him in. He had whispered, I like it here. I didn't register it at the time, but sitting at the table I didn't like it. What did that mean? I ran up the stairs and opened his door. He was sleeping just as he should have been. I almost laughed out loud. What was wrong with me? My son was home. That's all that mattered. A few nights ago I woke up in the middle of the night to see Daniel standing in the doorway. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there. I looked over to my wife, but she was sleeping. I turned back to Daniel. Hey there, Captain, are you okay? He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me and smiled, and for a second my blood turned cold. My flesh raised. That smile wasn't my son. Then he whispered something. I couldn't hear it. What was that? I asked him. Then he sprinted towards me. So fast. So quick. And he yelled, I like it here. Then he ran back out of our room and into his, slamming his door. My wife slept through the whole thing. Last night was the turning point. I was just about to lock the front door for the evening when my wife started screaming. And I mean screaming. I was convinced in the few seconds it took me to bound up the stairs that someone was killing her. In a way, I was right. I burst through the bedroom door to find Daniel standing over my wife with an axe. He had that dead smile on his face again. The axe was raised above his head when I tackled him. He started to scream, and I started to cry. He just kept repeating the same thing over and over again. You'll like it there. You'll like it there. You'll like it there. Now I'm lost. I don't know what to do, who to turn to. And as Halloween approaches, I think I have to go back. Back to the house where it all began. I'm going to take Daniel. Maybe he can show me where he wants us to go. Terminal C. My family and I moved to Denver about 2 years ago. I work for an art school that transferred me from my remote Orlando office, and the city that I had called home for the past 15 years, to the main college campus that is situated just outside of downtown Denver. I love it here. I love the mountains. I love the snow. I love the people. I love the culture that lives to be outside, celebrates diversity, and is crafted with tales of portals, Illuminati, and haunted public parks. I love that everyone here wants to keep Denver weird. When we touched down in Denver for the first time, we were greeted by a statue of a giant blue horse with glowing red eyes and menacingly large testicles. As we pulled away from Denver International Airport, the driver we had hired let me know that the horse is named Lucifer, and during construction its head had fallen off its body, killing its creator. Neat. Upon uprooting my wife and 2 children, 6 and 2, and moving out west, I was faced with an increasingly unrealistic cost of living. I had heard that Denver was more expensive than Orlando, and that should be expected, but I was not prepared for the dramatic increase in the price of rent, food, and everyday items. But we love it here, so I decided to make it work. I studied film in college, back in Orlando, so I started a wedding videography business to earn some extra income and help offset the added cost of living. Things were good. Many couples travel from out of state for destination weddings, and there was enough work to go around. I didn't mind the time away there, as it gave me a reason to explore my new state. A few weeks ago I received an email inquiring about videography services for a wedding. Generally, I will start discussing the filming of a wedding 6 months to a year prior to the date of. This request came in a few days before. There was no contact information or details pertaining to the couple. The email was brief, and contained only the following. $10,000 paid in full on Halloween night. We require your services. 9 p.m., Terminal C. When October 31st rolled around, I spent some time walking our neighborhood with my kids and watching the look of joy on their faces. My wife was slightly annoyed, albeit curious, at the fact that I was planning on leaving shortly thereafter to drive out to Denver International Airport with my full array of camera equipment to film a wedding that I knew nothing about. I agreed that the circumstances are bizarre, but if legit, the money was nothing to scoff at. If this was an elaborate hoax, I would waste nothing more than a few hours of driving and another chance to see more of this beautiful state. I stole a few peppermint patties, my wife's favorite, out of my son's basket, and insisted she eat them. Candy is the great equalizer, and I figured that after she had loaded up on sugar she might relax a bit. I was dressed in a black suit. The attire that I wear to weddings can vary depending on the venue, the dress code, and the weather. Because I knew next to nothing about the ceremony tonight, I opted to play it safe. Before I put on my jacket, I strapped on a GoPro with a chest mount. I've started to wear a GoPro to every wedding I film now to get added footage that records everything, uninterrupted. The data is automatically uploaded into MacLeod. My next foray will be into using a drone, but I haven't made it that far yet. I arrived at the airport, making note of Lucifer as I drove in, and parked in short-term parking. I had my camera equipment loaded up in a suitcase so that I didn't stand out too much from everyone else. I felt uneasy wandering around the airport without a real sense of direction, and it wasn't until I arrived at ticketing that I realized that there was no way I was going to be able to get through to Terminal C without a boarding pass. I approached customer service, and an older blonde woman with skin that looked like it was about to melt from her face gave me a dead-eyed acknowledgement. I told her my intentions, and without saying a word she walked around the counter and headed toward baggage claim. Instinctively I followed her. After a few moments she stopped, glanced up toward the ceiling and said, "Wait here." My eyes followed hers and I realized that I was standing directly underneath a small statue of a gargoyle emerging from a suitcase. I figured this was as good of a time as any to start, so I turned on my GoPro. As I waited I looked around, watching hundreds of people scurry back and forth without noticing anything around them. I had been worried about having a large suitcase and wandering aimlessly, but no one would have paid me any attention anyway. These people were blind to their surroundings. A weathered, handsome gentleman approached me and extended his hand. His blue suit was tailored perfectly so that even with his arm fully extended his pressed dress shirt underneath barely shone under his coat. I noticed his cufflinks, a small, unassuming triangle. He greeted me with a smile and signaled for me to follow him. He walked with a sense of urgency as we entered an elevator just off of the main concourse. He was not overly polite, nor rude in any fashion. He seemed determined to arrive at his destination. The elevator hummed as we made our descent downward. We exited, my luggage still lumbering behind me, and began to walk down a long granite corridor. Our footsteps echoed during the walk. Finally, we stopped outside of a large wooden door. I could hear the faint sounds of music on the other end mixed with the reverberation of men's voices. The man in the blue suit looked directly into my eyes and smiled. "Take a few moments to get your equipment set up, and then you can begin." I wanted to ask about an itinerary. What the names of the couple are. Were there any filming restrictions? For some reason, I could not muster any words. The man continued to smile. "Do you understand?" he asked. I nodded. I started to open my suitcase to remove my camera when the man handed me a mask. It was white with faux feathers and a long beak, much like the gargoyle I had seen near baggage claim. "Before you enter, put this on." The man's footsteps once again echoed down the hall as I adjusted my Steadicam mount. The sun was blinding. I moved my arm up to my eyes to block out the light as I blinked repeatedly and rapidly, hoping to adjust to the morning. My 2-year-old daughter crawled up onto my stomach and started banging on my chest. "Wake up, Daddy!" she bellowed. I sat up in bed. My wife stood in our doorway, staring back at me with a steaming cup of coffee in her hand. "Good morning. You planning on sleeping the entire day?" I was confused. I grabbed my phone and looked at the time. 10:22 a.m. Tuesday morning? Shit, I was late for work. I quickly hopped out of bed and rushed toward the bathroom to take a shower. "Slow down," my wife called after me. "Take a look outside. We got like 3 feet of snow last night. The roads are a mess. Your school closed today." I stared blankly back at her. "You think I would have let you oversleep? Go take a shower and come have coffee with me." My wife grabbed our daughter and slowly closed the bedroom door. I rubbed my eyes and started to take off my shirt. I heard my wife whisper to my daughter, "Daddy is very tired. He didn't get home until almost 4 a.m. The water from the shower head felt like cold needles on my skin. I tried to remember the events from the night before, but I couldn't recall anything that happened. My mind raced while simultaneously feeling clogged up. Had I drank a lot? How did I get home? The last fleeting moment I can recall was the sound of the man in the blue suit walking down the hallway. The echoing of the shoes felt like a stabbing pain in my head. I wrapped a towel around my waist and went back into my bedroom. I picked up my camera and flipped it on, navigating to the playback screen. There was nothing. The memory card was blank. I removed the card and inserted another. Again, nothing. Black screen. Blank card. I finished drying off and went out to the living room. My wife was smiling at me and she handed me a cup of coffee. I already checked our account and as of this morning, $10,000 was deposited. Seems like it was worth it. I stared back. It is? The money is there? Now my head was pounding. My wife asked me how everything went. I lied and told her it all went well. She asked me how the footage looked. I told her it was great. She asked me if the couple seemed to be in love. They are, I said. My son interrupted my trance. Dad, can we go sledding? I forced a smile. I dressed the kids in their snow jackets. From the closet, I grabbed their sleds and rubbed some oil on the runners. Time to move on, I thought aloud. Before heading outside, I grabbed my GoPro from the camera bag. We always strap the GoPro onto ourselves when we do things outdoors. It makes our home movies very exciting. The camera itself was already in the chest strap, and I suddenly remembered that I had been wearing it all night. I picked up my laptop and quickly logged into my cloud. I pulled up a continuous shot that was one large file. I pressed play and I was back at the airport, watching travelers walk back and forth, oblivious. I jumped forward in the timeline. I was walking down the corridor. The man in the tailored suit ahead of me. The echo of our shoes. I jumped forward again. The entire party was filled with guests in masks. Masks, much like the one the man had handed me to wear before I entered. The partygoers did not pay me much attention as they sipped on their cocktails and mingled with one another. I was just another gargoyle that no one bothered to notice. I jumped forward once more. The room was dimly lit, only by candlelight. A nightmare for footage. I walked slowly toward a large stone slab in the middle of the room. Cloaked figures flanked both sides of the table. Their masks hid their faces and their hoods hid their gender. Based on the build of the figures, I would guess that most were male. As I moved in closer, I could see a figure laying on the slab. She was nude, her face covered by a mask. It was hard to guess her age, but I would imagine mid-20s based on her build. Her arms and legs were bound to the corners of the table with a thick, blood-red ribbon. She did not struggle as she laid spread out for the cloaked men to stare at her. There were no words and very little sound. For a room this size with this many people in it, it was deathly quiet. In unison, the men started to hum. The hum grew louder and louder and the woman on the table started to writhe. The merging of the individual voices grew to a fever pitch. The circle of men shuffled their formation and allowed for a small entrance where another figure entered. This person, too, was cloaked in much the same way, but his mask was pure white. No features, just white porcelain. Without warning, the humming stopped. The woman on the table stopped moving. Deafening silence. The man disrobed. He was stark naked in front of the table. To his left, a robed figure handed him a knife. Only, this knife looked old and weathered. Its handle appeared wrapped in leather in the candlelight. Its blade was jagged. I'd be inclined to call it a dagger. The naked man licked the edge of the blade. He slowly bent over the bound woman and slid the dagger across her stomach. Not enough to inflict any pain, but enough to see her body tremble. When he was finished, he stood erect and surveyed the room. The silence was unnerving. Finally, he said to the room, "On this day, let us celebrate." Without warning, he lifted the knife high above his head. Both hands gripped the handle tightly with the blade facing down. The woman's body shook. The door to my bedroom swung open and my son and daughter charged in. I quickly shut the laptop and placed it aside. "Come on, Daddy! Let's go sledding," my son called out. I was trembling as I looked back at him. "I'll be just a minute." I gathered myself and put on my snow jacket. My snowshoes were nearly impossible to slip on with my hands shaking as badly as they were. Luckily, my gloves masked some of my nerves. I couldn't concentrate as every noise in the house was amplified in my head. The television, the kids chattering, the phone ringing. That hangover feeling again. I could tell that I was sweating, so I wiped my face on my sleeve. Returning to the living room, I picked up my son and threw him over my shoulder, doing my best to regain normalcy. "All right, let's go," I said. "I'm gonna throw you into a snow pile." As we started to walk out the front door, my wife called out for me. "Hey, hun. There is a man on the phone for you. He says he was at the ceremony last night, and he wants to inquire about your future services." I stared back at her for a moment, before replying, "Tell him I'll call him back." Little Lucy. Grandma Eloise had strictly forbidden everyone in the family from going into the attic of her old farmhouse. She insisted that the ceiling door was far too heavy, and that someone would throw out their back, get a splinter, or smash their fingers if they tried to lift it. She was so adamant about it, that her children and grandchildren never went further than the first or second step before she appeared around the doorway, wooden spoon in hand. Emily and Garrett Newsom learned to fear their grandma's wooden spoon shortly after their 5th birthday. The twins had been playing tag when Emily had ventured up the steps to escape her brother's reach. "Emily," he had whined. "That's not fair. We're not allowed up there." Emily blew a raspberry in his direction and proceeded to climb up the steps. She wasn't afraid of some door. She was 5 now, and she was going to prove that she was just as brave as any grown-up. As she made her way closer to the door, her brother's whining increased to teary-eyed, blubbering threats to tell Grandma. She ignored him. When she reached her hand up to feel the surface of the door, she was shocked to realize that it was cold. Much colder than it had been outside on that mild Halloween day. Before she could think about it further, she went down crying from the sting of a wooden spoon smacking her backside. Grandma had been furious and lectured the twins for 30 minutes about how that part of the house was dangerous and off-limits before putting them both in time-out. It was one of the twins' first memories of their grandmother, and the only time they ever saw her truly angry. 19 years to the day later, and the twins found themselves staring up at the mysterious door. It had once been a pristine white, but time and neglect had aged it into a peeling gray. The cobwebs of long-legged attic spiders had been woven over much of it, making it sticky to the touch. The twins shuddered. Neither one of them was a fan of spiders, but Garrett decided to put on a brave face and placed both hands on the door. He cringed inside at the feel of the thin spider silk clinging to his flesh. Under the webbing, the door was surprisingly cold and smooth, despite the peeling paint. He braced himself to push up against gravity and the weight of the door, and found that it barely weighed more than 20 pounds. Grandma had been full of it when she said it was heavy. That, or maybe that gym membership, was finally paying off. With ease he lifted the door and let it fall to the other side of its hinges. The door landed with a bang and a plume of dust rose into the air. Garrett poked his head into the dusty cavity and breathed in frigid air. "I don't know about this," he moaned to his sister. He had never been a fan of anything Halloween, horror, or macabre, and going through his dead grandma's forbidden attic looking for old pictures for her funeral on Halloween night seemed right up his nope alley. "What's the matter?" she sneered. "Afraid Grandma's ghost is still guarding the attic with that stupid wooden spoon?" She nudged her brother, urging him to get out of her way. She had never been afraid of the creepy and otherworldly. She had even joined a seance or two in college in the hopes of having some sort of otherworldly experience. Nothing ever came from them other than a girl getting so scared she peed herself at one and Emily hooking up with some frat boy at the other. Since then, Emily had decided that ghosts were nothing but a hoax, and the scariest thing you could get from trying to summon them was freshmen freaking out over a draft. When Garrett didn't budge, she glared at him. "You're afraid of make-believe ghosts and ghouls, aren't you?" "No. It's not that," he lied. "It's just... the attic feels freakishly cold. I'm worried that there's a hole around here letting cold air in, you know? And you know what else comes through holes in houses? Raccoons. Damned raccoons. You know how much I hate those damned trash pandas ever since the dumpster fire incident. The one where Frank Mazzino ended up having to get his eye removed because a flaming raccoon ran out and scratched the shit out of his face. They could be nested right under your nose, and you don't see them until they're right there biting your face off." His sister rolled her eyes and cocked a hip. She remembered how the dumpster fire incident had messed with her brother, but she knew a lie when she heard it. "Fine," she huffed. "How about you go look through Grandma's library and I'll fight the raccoons for whatever Grandma hid up here. Sound good?" The waves of cold chills running down Garrett's spine almost had him racing to do just as his sister suggested. If she wanted to provoke whatever was up here, she could be his guest. He didn't want anything to do with it. Not one thing. And yet... "No. It's fine," he said, holding a surprisingly steady voice. His pride wouldn't let him back down. He made his way up the last of the steps before helping his sister into the dark, frigid space. Emily cracked a joke about how Grandma Eloise was probably doing barrel rolls at the funeral home now that they were in the attic. Garrett managed a small scoff. The idea was kind of funny. The attic space was old and dusty but had a surprisingly sturdy floor. Cobwebs draped the A-frame rafters, making the place feel like a Halloween display, fitting for the time of year. The single, octagonal window had been boarded up to keep out bats, and only wisps of light from the moon trickled through. Emily flicked on her phone light, and they began their search. Garrett came across an old oak chest draped with a crocheted doily. The hinges creaked as he opened the lid. Inside he found some of Grandma's old cookbooks, a ton of Christmas cards, and a bunch of newspaper clippings with various family members being recognized over the years. Digging further down, he found several faded vintage photos. In one he recognized the man and woman as younger versions of his great-grandparents. They looked happier than in the other photos he had seen. Sitting on their laps he saw two little, curly-haired girls. He figured one was Grandma Eloise, but he didn't know who the other one was. She looked like her twin, but Grandma Eloise had never mentioned having a sister, so maybe it was a cousin. Their family had been notorious for strong family resemblances. He decided that it would work for the funeral. Picking it up, he found another family photo of the four taken a few years later. Great-Grandpa William had grown his signature handlebar mustache, and the girls looked older. Everyone had a solemn expression on their face. Garrett gasped. "What's the matter? You find your trash panda?" Emily snickered. "No, not quite." Garrett's head was reeling. I think I found a morning portrait." "So, like taken at sunrise?" Garrett gave her a frown. "No, a morning portrait. Like morning? You know, what we'll be doing tomorrow at Grandma's showing?" "Oh, that morning. Gotcha." She sat down the dolphin snow globe that she had been examining. "What's a morning portrait?" "It's an old-timey tradition where families would pose with the corpse of their loved one for one last photograph." Emily came over to examine the picture. "Whoa. Who's the second girl?" "I'm not sure. I thought it may have been a cousin. But now I'm thinking Grandma had a twin sister who died young. Look at this photo. See how the one girl is clear, but everyone else is blurry?" "Yeah. Back then everyone came out blurry because in the time it took for the photo to process, people moved, they breathed, they blinked. Only a corpse comes out clear." Emily squinted at the image. "Then why is that doll blurry?" She pointed to the dead twin. In the corpse's hand sat the fuzzy image of a doll with black hair and light eyes that looked directly at the camera, like it was trying to warn them. Garrett quickly stuffed the picture under the earlier one and shrugged. "No clue. Maybe the doll started slipping since it wasn't really being held." Emily nodded and went back to looking through knickknacks. A few minutes later Garrett jumped, smacked his head off one of the ceiling beams, and cursed when a music box began playing. "Damn it, Emily! Give me a warning before you decide to start playing freaking creepy music from one of those trinkets." Emily stared at him wide-eyed. "You mean it wasn't you?" She moved her phone around to find a small music box with a tiny ballerina turning on her post. The ballerina's face appeared to have been filed off. Round and round the faceless dancer spun until her outstretched arm pointed in the direction of a chair covered in a yellowed lace wedding dress. Emily took it off to look at. Garrett gaped and saw the doll from the photo sitting on the chair. She was bound with a rope around her body and a gag in her mouth. She was no bigger than a baby. Her face was an incredibly pale shade of porcelain, with dark circles under her eyes. Those creepy light eyes from the photo turned out to be a glassy blue that felt like they were piercing Garrett's soul. Her hair was disheveled, and the red paint from her lips had rubbed off onto the gag. Emily unbound the doll and straightened out her ruffled dress. She found a bracelet around her neck inscribed with a name. "Lucy," she read. "Do you think this was Grandma's sister's name?" Garrett didn't answer his sister. He was too busy staring at the doll. He could have sworn her face had changed in the time it took him to blink. The paint was no longer smudged around her mouth, and her painted eyebrows were drawn in a look of concern. In the next blink of his eyelids, the doll's glass eyes changed from staring at him to staring at the far wall of the attic. Just then, a sound like dog nails clicking on floor tiles started coming from the edges of the attic. "What's that?" his sister squeaked, clutching the doll closer. Garrett's mouth was dry. Dread welled up in his gut as the air in the attic dropped low enough that he could see his breath. No, wait. He was holding his breath, wasn't he? The floor door slammed shut. Garrett looked back at the doll to see her staring at him again. Bloody tears streamed down her face, and she wore a look of horror and apology a second before Emily's phone died. The clicking of the nails stopped as the twins grabbed a hold of each other. "Garrett?" his sister squeaked. "Please tell me this is some sort of joke. Some sort of prank to get me to think ghosts are real." He clutched his sister tighter, the doll forgotten between them. "Only if you tell me first." Demonic laughing like nails on slate filled the air from all around. The twins tried to cover their ears, but it did no good. Shadows darker than the blackest night rose from the edges of the room, first amorphous, and then taking on twisted shapes. The music box started playing in loud, echoing notes as the shadowy creatures began to sing. Poor little Lucy, bound and gagged in fear. Now she's free to be our cheer. Dear little Lucy, with the purest heart. She can't save a snitch and a tart. Dumb little Lucy, thinks she'll bloody cry. All because her friends are gonna die. With the last line of the cacophony, the twins could hear a small voice between them crying out, "No! Please! I can't take this anymore. Why? They don't deserve this." The demons laughed their screeching chortle once more before going silent. Garrett and Emily stood petrified, like rabbits surrounded by starving wolves. Without warning, the demons howled, and the twins felt the pain of their souls being shredded and torn from their bodies. Claws and fingers sliced and ripped into the very fiber of their beings, cutting the sinews of spirit that held their souls to their physical forms. The pain was like nothing the twins had ever experienced before. The twins screamed and writhed, desperately trying to free themselves of the demon's grips, but it couldn't be helped. Lucy slid to the ground and watched through blood-stained eyes as her best friend's family members died the same horrible death she had. To any normal onlooker, they would just see two people standing motionless with wide-eyed expressions on their faces until their bodies collapsed. But Lucy could sense it all. Every piece of their souls being ripped and gnawed on. Every twist of pain as another sinew was cut. Every scream of the twin souls. Images of when Lydia had succumbed to the demons came flooding back to Lucy's mind. How they had almost snatched Eloise, too. It was too much, but all Lucy could do was sit there and cry her bloody tears as the demons screamed in delight. Their teeth glistened and dripped with black saliva as they devoured the last of Emily and Garrett, each demon taking turns taunting their favorite dolly. Poor little Lucy, always there to see how cruel we demons are to sinners such as thee. Stupid little Lucy, when whilst thou see that this is the fate of all sinners. Defeated little Lucy, might we lap up some of your tears? The demons continued to laugh and jeer late into the night before leaving little Lucy to grieve surrounded by the corpses of Emily and Garrett Newsom. 2 days later the cops dragged the bodies of the twins from their late grandmother's attic. Nothing seemed amiss. It was like they had just dropped dead. This would make all the headlines for at least the next month. Not much happened in the town of Raleightsburg, and a double homicide on Halloween was the biggest news since the dumpster fire incident several years back. Officers Elroy and Mac had been first on the scene for that incident, and were now finding themselves on the scene of this one. They checked the house one last time that night before heading out. It was getting late and Officer Mac's wife would be mad if he missed dinner because of work again. She had been hormonal with the pregnancy, and he didn't want to rock that boat tonight. Officer Elroy was just as willing to head out as he was. Something about the old house set her nerves on edge. Walking through the kitchen, they heard a music box begin playing in the living room. Officer Elroy drew her gun with Officer Mac behind her. There hadn't been any of the forensics team left in the house, they were sure of it. Perhaps some punk with a camera came in to try to get a shot of the crime scene and bumped a music box. They rounded the corner and crept into the living room. On the coffee table sat a music box with a small ballerina with a filed-off face. She stopped with her stretched-out arm pointing to a doll sitting on the mantel. She hadn't been there earlier, right? Officer Elroy looked at her and then gasped. Her eyes dripped tears of blood as the room became impossibly cold, and the signing began. Poor little Lucy, sitting on a shelf. Eyes streaming red as she's crying to herself. My little Lucy, this won't take too long. Soon all you'll have will be our little song. Sweet little Lucy, wouldn't hurt a fly. She can't help you, now you're gonna die.